Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we are revisiting an old favourite of mine. It's the Grixis Brain in the Jar deck. Since the last time we've played it, a lot of cards have been fixed that were key parts of the deck. There's been a few cards in Eldritch Moon that actually suit this deck quite nicely as well, so I thought it was about time we came back and looked at an old deck, and here we are. So what does Grixis Brain in the Jar do? It essentially plays Rise from the Tides at instant speed at the end of your opponent's turn to avoid board wipes and languishes and stuff like that. Which essentially means this deck has an instant win if you can set it up perfectly. So the deck focuses around Brain in the Jar to help you do this. So for 2 mana, you get an artifact with pay 1, tap it, put a charge counter on Brain in the Jar. Then you may cast an instant or sorcery with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Brain in the Jar from your hand without paying its mana cost. So for 1 mana every turn, you can play a increasingly more expensive card as you go along. So it's very important that we have a nice little curve going, so that we can always use Brain in the Jar to the fullest extent. So we have a lot of 2 drops, 3 drops, 4 drops, and 5 drops, and then finally 6 drops. And here is the win con for the deck, Rise from the Tides. So for 5 and a blue, sorcery speed, though it's not likely to be so. Put a 2/2 black zombie token onto the battlefield, tapped for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. So you'll notice, if it'll let me zoom out, then we have a lot of non-creature cards, and that's because most of them are actually instants and sorceries. The only exception of which is Possess Scab, which allows us to grab back said instants and sorceries if we so need them. So we've got a bit of a self-mill strategy here, and also a little bit of a control board to help us stay alive, essentially. So changes from the last deck: instead of Fiery Impulses, we now have Galvanic Bombardments, and I've put them up to a 4 of as well. Since they get increasingly good the more you have in your graveyard, and the more of them you have and the more of them you use, it's a very good, strictly better version of Fiery Impulse. And we do a lot of self-milling, so it does mean maybe the first time we use Galvanic Bombardment it could do about 5 damage to a creature, so it's pretty good. It's an instant speed, 1 red mana. Galvanic Bombardment deals X damage to the target creature, where X is 2 plus the number of cards named Galvanic Bombardment in your graveyard. So it's really good. It'll do 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. It's pretty sweet. Brain in the Jar we have spoke of. There is also a second mode as well on Brain in the Jar. You can pay 3 to remove X charge counters from Brain in the Jar, and it allows you to scry. So if you've gotten to the Brain in the Jar 6 and it didn't go quite as well, then you can pay 3 to remove them and you can start the cycle again. You can remove as many charge counters as you want, so you could take it back down to 5, so you can bring it up to 6 on the next turn. It's completely up to you. So you can keep going for second tries as well. But we try not to focus too much on this. Next we've got Disperse. It's 1 and a blue, instant speed. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So this is to slow down things like mill. Although when we used to play this deck, mill was actually a really good setup, because all we had to do was play our land drops and have a Rise from the Tides in our hand. And that literally meant that we'd win, in a nutshell, because they were milling all of our sorceries into our graveyard. So they killed themselves by milling us, which is really fun. So if you do absolutely hate mill in all of its forms, this is the deck for you, because it pretty much just takes a dump all over mill for the most part. You just have to get a little lucky on your draws, but you know, you've got 3 Rise from the Tide, so you just have to hit 1 of them and just hit lands from that point on, and you're pretty much good to go. Next we have Nagging Thoughts. It's a 1 and a blue, sorcery speed. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand, the other into your graveyard. And it also has Madness as well, though that won't be too relevant. However, we do now have Take Inventory, so we might be drawing a hell of a lot of cards. So potentially we might be discarding back down to hand size with this deck. So this allows you to check the top 2 cards of your library and pick whichever one suits you best. So you might need a land at the time, so you grab a land, and even if you drop a sorcery into the graveyard, it's really good for you because it helps you Rise from the Tides later on. So it allows you to set up your graveyard and set up your hand and just, yeah, pick the best cards that suit you. Moving on, we've got 1 and a blue. It's take inventory, sorcery speed, draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named take inventory in your graveyard. So it's the same as Galvanic Bombardment except for card draw. So this is going to allow us to draw 1 card, 2 cards, 3 cards, 4 cards. It's pretty sweet. And hopefully we discard to hand size and we can get all of that jazz going. So I'm not too sure about take inventory, but we'll see how it goes. Because we do want to drop some of our instants and sorceries into our graveyard, but having them in our hand obviously means that we can use them. Next we have Geist Blast. 2 and a red, instant speed. This allows us to make our mythics doubles, essentially. So at its base, it does 2 damage to target creature or player. Great to take down early game creatures. Probably a good idea to use it as such, because you want to use it for its secondary ability. That's why it's here. So it's got also 2 and a blue. You get to exile it from your graveyard and copy target instant and sorcery you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So the main reason you'd want to copy anything is to copy Part the Water Veil. Oops, Part the Water Veil. Take an extra turn after this one. If you copy this, they stack, and that actually means you can take 2 extra turns after this. So you get the turn that you cast it to set it up, you get the extra turn to play Rise from the Tides, and then you get the extra turn after that to get a free attack in before your opponent can do anything about it. So it's pretty sweet like that. You can also use it to double up on pieces of the puzzle if you need to fill your graveyard up. One of these things that this deck does really well is self-mill. Most of the time, if you're doing it well, then you've got about 5 cards left in your deck by the time you've won. And you have won by that time. I don't think there's anything in the format really that can fight Rise from the Tides at instant speed, essentially. Which is why it's sorcery speed, so that people get a chance to fight back, but we've found ways around that, so we can exploit the fact that Brain in the Jar allows us to do it at instant speed and stuff like that. Brain in the Jar also, I'd like to point out, can languish at instant speed, and that is something your opponent will never anticipate. It's just not going to happen. But yeah, it seems to come as a surprise to everyone when this happens. But yeah, you can even Collective Defiance. I'm not sure if you can escalate with Brain in the Jar. I suppose we're about to find out. I doubt it, though. I really doubt it. I think it'll just be choose one mode. But anyway, pieces of the puzzle. 2 and a blue. This is one of the key cards in the deck. It allows us to self-mill ourselves and to set up our hand as well. So reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You may put 2 instant or sorcery cards from among them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So you can pick your Rise from the Tides and you Part the Water Veils, the cards that you need. You can take them at will, and that will allow you to set up your little combo. You can also refuse to take any cards at all if you want to fill up your graveyard with instants and sorceries. And we are running a lot of them, so the chances are when you pick in the 2, you're going to drop another one in anyway, so you are filling up your graveyard. It also adds itself to that list as well. So it's really good for that, and we can grab whatever we might have missed with Possessed card as well, which is pretty sweet. Moving on, we've got Radiant Flames. One of the reasons to run 3 colours in this deck is to run Radiant Flames to allow us to sweep the board and control it while we build up our combo. So for 2 and a red, it has Converge. It deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of colours spent to cast Radiant Flames. So if you cast Radiant Flames with Brain in the Jar, it's not going to do anything because you didn't spend any colours. However, if you paid 3 colours on Radiant Flames and Geist Blasted it, the copy has the number of colours. So this can be copied to do up to 6 damage to each creature, which is pretty sweet with Geist Blast. So you got to bear that in mind. But yeah, you do not want to Brain in the Jar and Radiant Flames. It just won't work. Or at least I don't think it does. Correct me if I'm wrong. Moving on, we've got Collective Defiance, a new copy from Eldritch Moon that I think will suit this deck quite nicely. So for 1 and 2 red, it's Sorcery Speed with target player can discard all the cards in his hand and draw that many cards. So this is useful for filling up our graveyard if we don't have the right cards. It can also be to find our combo as well if we don't have it in hand and we want to have a redraw. If we know our opponents just tutored something up, we can make them discard it, for example. We can also deal 4 damage to a creature, which helps us control the board, and 3 damage to an opponent, which might be the difference between winning and losing, perhaps, if we can't quite get to 20 damage worth of Rise from the Tides, though that is quite unlikely, I will say. But yes, it also has Escalate as well, so we can pay 1 for each mode chosen beyond the first. And that means that we could do all 3 if we chose to do so on this one. And once we've selected all the modes, we can Geist Blast it, and then the 3 modes will count in that sense as well. Moving on, we've got Languish, speaks for itself really, 2 and 2 black, sorcery speed, all creatures get -4/-4 until the end of the turn, so it's a nice board wipe. Yet again, can be Geist Blasted to give -8/-8. Can be used with Brain in the Jar to play it at instant speed as well, to wipe the board whenever we feel like it. So yeah, it speaks for itself mostly, it's a board wipe. There's a lot of board wipes in this deck, and for good reason as well. We have Possessed Scabs, so this is the only creature in the deck. 3, a blue and a black, creature zombie. When it enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery or creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is to allow us to get back our Part the Water Veil, it's allow us to get back our Rise from the Tides, whichever one we choose to get. Its downside is whenever it would die, it gets exiled instead, but we're not too fussed about that because we don't have a way to get it back. So for us, once Possessed Scab's gone, it's gone. But it allows us almost entirely, since we're self-milling, to tutor up whatever card we want as well. So we can literally take any card in our deck and Possessed Scab will hit it. For the most part, I think Brain in the Jar is the only thing it won't hit. Yes, that is literally the case. Moving on, we've got Power of the Pages, 3 and 2 blue, draw 3 cards, untap 2 lands, then discard a card. So, this has got some special synergies with Brain in the Jar, also special synergies with our deck. So, to start off, draw 3 cards, pretty sweet for 5 mana. Untap 2 lands, if we've Brain in the Jar, that's actually gained us, netted us an extra mana, because we paid 1 to Pore Over the Pages, then we get to untap 2 lands. So we can actually gain a little bit of mana as well through this, which is pretty sweet. If we have to float our mana manually as well though, so we might see that happen. My mouse has gone dead. Oops. Hang on. But yes, Pore Over the Pages is pretty sweet for that. It does allow us to discard cards into our graveyard as well, which means that we can set up our Rise from the Tides. It's likely to be one of the last few things that we do in our deck before we combo off, since at 6 we want to Rise from the Tides or Part the Water Veil. So yes, once we're at 6 mana, and once Brain in the Jar is at 5 counters, we want to tap it and bring it to 6 counters, and either do one of these 2 things. Part the Water Veil, so we could Part the Water Veil for 1, in a nutshell, if we've set it up perfectly. And for 4, we can then take 2 extra turns. We can also do the exact same thing for Rise from the Tides and get up to 10... we only need 10 instants and sorceries in our graveyard to have a lethal amount of damage on an empty board, essentially. So we have to sort that out. So yeah, it also has an Awaken cost as an alternative win con. I probably won't ever use this unless it's just outright going to kill our opponent. Because we want to set up our extra turns as well. So we want like 2 extra turns, Rise from the Tides, finish off our opponent. Speaks for itself, really. So that's the deck in a nutshell. Let's move on to the land base. So we have a lot of blue, as you can see. So we've got 8 islands. We have 1 swamp because a lot of our duels make up for the only black card in our deck, which is Languish and Possessed Scab for a single black. So we don't really need extra swamps for this. And then we also have 1 mountain as well, because yet again our dual lands are going to make up for the lack of mountains in the deck. Might consider actually, on the fly, changing that. Because since then I've actually added some extra red mana in here. And also Galvanic Bombardments are quite interesting as well. So yeah, we're actually going to have 2 mountains in here, 7 islands. And then we've got our 2 Wandering Fumaroles, so allows us to get in that little bit of extra damage, allows us to block creatures, to stall out the game a little bit. And yeah, it's just a blue-red tap land other than that. A lot of our dual lands will always have blue in there, and also the opposite colour as well, just to make up for the fact that blue is so important to us. We have a lot of blues, a lot of double blues as well, so if we were to be stuck on one colour, blue is the colour that we'd have to be stuck on. The rest of it's fine. We then have one Smouldering Marsh. It is our black and red, so extra swamp and mountain there. Comes in tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands, quite likely to happen because we have a lot of basics. And then we have one Sunken Hollow for the exact same reason. Yet again, blue side and black to make up for the lack of swamps that we have in the deck. And then we have our Drowned Catacombs, extra blue and black to make up for the lack of swamps. And Sulphur Falls, extra blue and extra mountains to make up for the lack of mountains we have. Drownyard Temples are an interesting addition to the deck. It's a colourless land, which isn't very good, but it allows us to return Drownyard Temple from our graveyard to the battlefield. So we do a lot of self-milling, and a lot of our self-mill cards won't allow us to touch lands. So by not selecting these, we are allowed to ramp up a little bit if we're on 3 mana. We can pull these back from our graveyard and ramp up to that extra little bit of mana, so we can potentially get to our Rise from the Tides turn early, which is pretty sweet. And finally, we have Evolving Wilds, 3 of. We get to sacrifice it, search our library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle our library. So this is the mana fixing to make up for the fact that we don't have many swamps and mountains. We can search them up in the early game if we should need them. Right, guys, that's actually going to do it for the deck for today. So if you like the look of the deck, be sure to check out the games that should be following shortly after this. If you love the deck tech, then be sure to leave a like. It helps me out a great deal. If you haven't already subscribed, be sure to subscribe for the more matches that should be following and more Magic Duels content. It helps me out a great deal as well, guys. If you're not quite sure, stay for the end card where you will find a link to the matches and the rest of my content. So, yes, I'll see you next time, guys. Have a good day. Bye.